Good evening and welcome, everyone. My name is Renee Cummins of Deutsche Bank, and I, along with Erica Frey of Barclays, co-lead the collective. I am pleased to have the honor of welcoming you to our third annual Juneteenth event. It's all in the numbers. A little bit about the collective, Cross-Firm Black Employee Resource Group, also known as CF Berg. We are a network of Black ERG leaders, mainly in financial services, with the mission to create opportunities for Black professionals to network, share best practices, and collaborate on engagement in philanthropic initiatives to support our local communities. We are about 70 members strong and represented by 33 firms, including the top 10 Wall Street firms. This Saturday is Juneteenth, and it's a day we celebrate in the Black community because it represents an Independence Day. Although the Emancipation Proclamation was issued on January 1st, 1863, it wasn't until June 19th, 1865, that Union General Gordon Granger in Galveston, Texas, read Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation to enslaved African Americans. At that time, Texas was one of the most remote and southern slaveholding states and was the last state to have the proclamation read. And many of you may have already heard or seen, but I'm really excited to note that as of about an hour ago, Juneteenth has officially been recognized as a national holiday. We certainly have a ways to go, but this is a major step in the right direction. So today's event is going to take a deep look into the term some of you may have heard before, the Black tax, which is understood to be the financial cost of conscious and unconscious anti-Black discrimination. So what are these numbers? I have the great pleasure of introducing our speaker today, Shawn Rochester, who has done extensive research on what it really costs to be Black in America, and he will take us through these numbers. And in truth, some of them may surprise you. A little bit about Shawn. Shawn Rochester is the CEO of Good Steward LLC and the founder of PhD Enterprises and the Idea Institute. These organizations provide financial education and advisory services to consumers, increase the presence of Black employees and enterprises in US public and private sectors, payroll, and on the African continent. Shawn is also the author and sought-after speaker who has spoken on Wall Street, in Silicon Valley, and leading universities and the United Nations about the staggering financial cost of discrimination against Black people in America, and a new economic framework to help create the millions of jobs and businesses that are missing in the Black community. Shawn is the author of The Black Tax, The Cost of Being Black in America, and CPR for the Soul, How to Give Yourself a 20% Raise, Eliminate Your Debt, and Leave an Inheritance for Your Children's Children. But before we kick off tonight's event, we're going to do a giveaway. So one lucky person will win a free copy of Shawn's book, The Black Tax, The Cost of Being Black in America. To enter the drawing, please share hashtag CFBerg. It should be at the bottom of your screen. Please share hashtag CFBerg in the comments section. The more times you hashtag, the greater the opportunity for you to be selected in the drawing. So while you're getting your hashtags loaded, we will take a moment to thank our sponsors.
Pacesetter sponsors: Bank of America, BNY Mellon, Bank of Montreal, Deutsche Bank, IHS Markit, Morgan Stanley, London Stock Exchange Group. Institutional sponsors: Council of Urban Professionals, DWS, FactSet, Mizuho, RBC Capital Markets, UBS.
So I hope you all have your hashtags ready, hashtag CFBerg. Looks like we're getting some good entries. It's the last chance for you to enter your hashtag to win the drawing. Here we go. Congratulations to Daria. Oh, wait, hold on. Live TV. There we go. Hashtag congratulations to Ann Savage. We will be in contact with you to get you your book. And so with that, I'm going to hand it over to Shawn.
Renee, thank you for that wonderful introduction. Thank you for the collective and your associated sponsors for sponsoring this really important conversation, associated with Juneteenth. I want to take a moment and I'm going to share some charts that we're going to walk through. If you just give me a second, I will pull them up. All right. Hopefully that is visible to everyone. Once again, thank you very much. My name is Shawn Rochester, as was said, and I wrote a book called The Black Tax, The Cost of Being Black in America. And in that book, I talk about the financial costs of discrimination. Now, normally when people talk about discrimination, they tend to speak about it from, the perspective of the injustice or the immorality. I wanted to look at things differently. I wanted to look at it from the perspective of what is the cost of discrimination, and more importantly, what do institutions what do some of the finest institutions in the country say that those costs are? So the book is broken into three parts. In the first part of the book, I take a look at the Black tax in a modern context, in markets and areas that are really critical for wealth accumulation for Black people in particular. So that's housing, it's automotive, it's the insurance and financing that underpin those. It's the job search, high-end careers, online commerce, capital raising for business, and so on and so forth. In the second part, I do a look back from the time of slavery and just really walk through looking at discriminatory practices from an economic perspective. In the third part of the book, I do a summary on where we are now from an economic perspective, and I introduce a framework that's called, PhD. And PhD stands for purchase, hire, and deposit in ways that create jobs, create and expand business, and provide capital, right, in the Black community. Why is this of, particular importance? Because pre-COVID, we're missing about 6 million jobs across the broader, Black community. Pre-COVID, we're missing about 1.4 million businesses with employees. Most people may be aware that you got about 2.56 million Black businesses, but folks tend to not be aware that only about 4% of those have employees. And that 4%, which represents about 109, maybe 110,000 businesses, they generate about $100 billion in revenue and employ about, close to a little over 1 million people, right? So what we're talking about are really large, massive gaps and significant economic effects, associated with it. And these gaps in terms of the jobs and business and capital, and we talk about, the capital piece of it. And when we talk about the size of the wealth gap, it's about $841,000 difference between the mean wealth of a Black family versus white family. And that's across 17 million Black families or so. So it adds up to about 14 trillion. So these are really, really large gaps, right? And massive problems. And it's really important that we have a lot of people, around the table, much like we have here, to get together and work together to solve these challenges, right? But one of the things that we all know, it is even when we have terrific people at the table, it's really tough to work on effective problem solving if A, people don't, see the problem, or B, if they think you're the problem, right? If you would just fix you, we would be great. So I just want to share a couple of platitudes with you that you may have heard. First is Black folks are simply not trying hard enough. That has more to do with not getting ahead. Any type of racial discrimination. You've got over 6 in 10 Americans that believe that. You may have heard that Black people have the same or better chance than white people to get ahead in America. There's over 6 out of 10 Americans that believe that. Or you might have heard that racism, quite frankly, is an excuse for failure, right? The failure is mine, but instead of me taking ownership of it and fixing and resolving it, I spend all my time pointing a finger at other people and blaming folks, right? You got over 7 to 10 Americans that believe that. Part of the challenge here is if this is the background thinking and resonance that's happening, then that level of thinking is actually going to show up in the very plans and policies and programs that are put in place to solve these really difficult issues. And the other thing that I think it's important that we all know is that effective problem solving really is based on a foundation of empathy and understanding, right? With empathy being our ability to put ourselves in other people's shoes, to really see things from their perspective, and also to understand the pathology, right? Like, how did they arrive at that place, in the first place? And then, of course, you have understanding, which is how we use data and information to make the world a better place for ourselves and for our fellow man. So what I want to do right now is share a quote, with you. This quote is from Albert Einstein, and he gave this in his address to the National Urban League back in 1946. And he says, "We must make every effort to ensure that the past injustice and economic discrimination, which by definition is the Black tax, will be made known to the people. The taboo, let's not talk about it, must be broken." So taking heed from Mr. Einstein, let's talk about it. So one of the things that I want to kind of discuss in a short time that we have together this evening is to answer this question, right? Which is, how is it that after over 400 years, more than 40 million African Americans only own about 2% of US wealth? Like how is that possible, right? Either we are colossally and consistently inept, or there is something else going on in the background that we need to take a closer and deeper look at. So let's do that, right? Let's take a closer and deeper look at it. So what we're going to do is we're going to go back, right, to the time of slavery. We're going to kind of walk forward as much as we can into the present. And we're going to look at, discriminatory practices that you may or may not be familiar with. So we're going to go back to a time of slavery. I won't talk about the horrors of it in particular, but we'll look at it from an economic perspective. One of the important things that's really critical that we understand is that slavery by definition is a 100% tax on the enslaved person's labor, right? Nothing that you produce is yours, not even you, right, are yours. And there are many things from this time period that we could never put a price on, right? You could never put a price on what it is to be a man and to be unable to protect your family, right, and your loved ones, or what it is to be a woman and to be unable to control your body for the entirety of your life, or to know that you have to reconcile with children being sold and so on and so forth. But there are things that you can value. And you can look at what is the economic cost of labor extracted from millions and millions of people over almost a 250-year period, right? And economists have looked at this, right? And one of the things, and they came up with some of their estimates say that the number is as high as $24 trillion, some place it as high as 97 trillion. If we assume that the truth is somewhere in the middle, we're talking about as high as about $50 trillion in terms of labor extracted from millions of people over almost a quarter of a millennium in today's equivalent. But that's not the only thing that you can price from that time, right? If you go back to about 1860, we all know that there are about 4 million people that are held in bondage, right? And those 4 million people they're the most liquid asset, right? In the country. They are 50% of the full, economic value of the South. And they are traded on open markets, right? There's a price if you're old or young, if you're male or female, if you're able-bodied or lame, right? So these folks are traded. And it turns out that the value of these people who are held in bondage, right, at that time is so large that you either have to measure it in terms of GDP, right, or national income, or national wealth, right? So the estimates are that their value was between 16 and 20% of US wealth, or 1 to 2 years of GDP. So if you look at that from a wealth perspective, we're talking about $15.5 trillion. How do we arrive at that number? At the time that I was doing the research, national wealth was about 85 trillion. It's much more than that. Presently, 16 to 20% of that is 14 to 17 trillion. Take an average of those two, you're at 15.5, right? If you look at it from an income perspective, it's about 28.5 trillion. If you look at things pre-COVID, GDP was about $19 trillion. 1 to 2 years of that is 19 to 38 trillion. Taking an average of that, you're at 28.5. If you take an average of those two different independent modes of valuing those folks, we're going to come up with about $22 trillion. Now, we can even go further back to 1839, and we can look at Henry Clay, who was laying out the economic cost of people held in bondage at that time. He puts that number at $1.2 billion back in 1839. If you look at some work done by Thomas Piketty, he says the average return on slave-related investments is between 6 and 8% per annum. So if we even take a number that's lower than that range, about 5.5%, and we bring forward that 1.2 billion, you're at about over 24 trillion. If you don't know who Henry Clay is, or he doesn't really stack up in the annals, we can go back to the 1810s and we can look at estimates from Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, and they place the value of people held in bondage at that time at about 1 year of GDP, about $19 trillion in today's equivalent, or the equivalent of selling 1/3 of all land in the public domain, right? So, what we're talking about here is really massive, hard to conceive numbers. So let's kind of explore a little bit of the economic implication. At the time that I was doing this work, the net worth of about 45 million or so, African Americans was about $1.5 trillion. We just established that the value of people held in bondage had an equivalent today of about 22 trillion. The implication of which is that people held in bondage over 150 years ago had 15 times more economic value than 45 million, free people today in terms of their net worth. And that's really just kind of the numbers, right? So you've got the extraction of an extraordinary amount of wealth associated with labor over almost a quarter of a millennia, right, associated with that. And then you have the impact of people held in bondage. Now, you could say quite fairly that while these are terrifically large numbers, right, that was a long time ago, right, well over 150 years. And there's been a lot of time to accumulate resources since that time. Other people have come to the country and they've been discriminated against. They've had extraordinarily difficult times, but they've gone on to do actually quite well from an economic perspective. And yet we still see, Black people in the situation. And I think what's important to understand is that people left bondage, with no economic resources, right? There was some talk about, 40 acres and a mule. We're familiar with that. We all know that that was never distributed, right? There was an actual distribution of land through the Homestead Act. And one of the things I thought would be interesting to take a look at is what would be the value of that in today's dollars, right? So if something like 40 acres and a mule had happened, right? If 40 acres, had been distributed to each of the folks held in bondage, we're talking about 160 million acres, right? It's a massive number, right? I once looked at purchasing 400 acres with a group of friends. For 400 acres, you got to go up in a helicopter, right? To kind of envision 160 million acres is extraordinary. If we look at the typical pricing, right, of an acre at the time that, we did this work, it was, between $3,020 and $6,350. Again, these aren't kind of Manhattan or Bay Area or Miami Beach type of acres. This is rural, farmland, right? So quick math on this would put the value of 40 acres and a mule at about $1 trillion on the high end, right? Generating about $90 billion, a year. Now, while that sounds like a large number, and from a nominal perspective, it is, if you compare it to the 50 trillion potentially that was extracted from these folks over a quarter of a millennia, it's 2%, right? And not even 2% of what was extracted from these folks was allowed in terms of, startup capital and resources. But there was an actual distribution. So if you move forward to about 1862, Congress passes an act, right, called the Homestead Act. We'll remember this from kind of junior high school or middle school and high school. And during the 60-year period, they distributed 246 million acres to about 1.5 million, white families. If you do a similar math on this, and we're just looking at farm acreage right here, that's about $1.6 trillion on the high end, which is a little more than $1 million per family, right? And I'm all about hard working and bootstraps and the like, but $1 million per family is an extraordinary start, right? So how did this Homestead Act work, right? The idea was you had the opportunity to claim about 160 acres of land. And if you were so fortunate to make that claim and you stayed on it for 5 years, at the end of that period, you could take possession of that land. Now, if you were also a person who was, coming from Europe with nothing but the shirt on your back, and you were so fortunate to be able to stake one of these claims, at the end of that 5-year period, you not only took possession of the land, but you could also naturalize, right? But that's about how long it took to become, a citizen back in those days. So we're talking about a massive start, right, in life, an extraordinary, government kind of giveaway. In terms of direct beneficiaries, researchers say that number is about up to 93 million white Americans are direct beneficiaries of this massive kind of giveaway. Again, this is not secondary, tertiary related in some kind of way. These are kind of direct beneficiaries of this. If we so on the one hand, you've got $1 trillion, right, that was proposed and discussed, but not actually distributed from people from whom 50 trillion was extracted. But then you actually do have a real distribution of almost $2 trillion, right, to another segment of the population, right? So you have very difficult time and a start in life. By 1870, Black people in America own about 0.17% of U.S. wealth, not quite zero, but effectively zero. If we kind of fast forward, the Civil War, right, has occurred. Clearly, the Southern economy has been devastated. The global cotton market has been devastated, and land confiscated in the South has been returned, right, to the white, planter class. And there is a need for massive, available and abundant labor, right? So just to circle back here and to underscore a couple of really important points. When we say that the global cotton market is devastated, what we have to remember is like cotton at that time was like the equivalent of oil today. Right, raw cotton from the South represents about 61% of U.S. exports, and the U.S. dominates 80% of the global cotton market. There are about 20 million people employed, and that market around the world, 1 million of those folks lose their job, and the world winds up in what's called a global cotton famine. Right, so it affects everywhere. It affects India and Egypt, and clearly Europe. Even as far as Japan, just the full industrialized world at that time. And the world is crying out, what is America going to do to put her newly freed people back to work, right? And the answer to that is this thing that's called Jim Crow, and an extremely non-descriptive name. Like, what is this kind of Jim Crow thing? And it is effectively a system of laws and customs that are reinforced with an extraordinary level of violence to reimpose 100% tax on a sharecropper's labor. Now, I know what you're thinking, which is like, Shawn, clearly these people were poor, and we know that. But 100% tax sounds hyperbolic, right? And I understand what you're saying. And this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to let you be the judge, right, of whether or not this was a 100% tax. So let's kind of talk about it a little bit. So what is this sharecropping, and how does it work at a fundamental level? Well, those large mega plantations were broken into smaller lots, right, post-emancipation. And Black families would agree to settle on those lots and plant and cultivate cash crops and take those crops to market. And in exchange for doing that, they would share in a portion of the crops when it was taken to market. That's literally where the name comes from, right? Sharecropping. Now, here's the thing that's important to understand. It is a contract, right? And in the contract, the terms and conditions are set by the white landowner. Some of those terms and conditions say that if you should fall ill, they have the right to outsource your labor to someone else and charge you back for it. Other things that is important for us to understand is that these newly freed people have no wealth, right? And the harvest doesn't come tomorrow. The harvest comes at the end of the year or at the end of the season. So between now and then, that white landowner has to give you food and clothes and shelter and tools and everything, seed and everything that you need to bring that crop to market. So they effectively control your cost structure. Right now, the other thing that's very important to understand is that when you bring those crops to market, that white landowner is the market, right? He tells you what the crops are worth. So if a person controls your cost structure and they also control your revenue or your income, by definition, they control your profit. So I think you see where I'm going with this 100% tax on labor. Now, if you are fortunate, you'll work for a landowner who will ensure that your profit is zero. If you are unfortunate and you work for a landowner who does not want you to be able to move to someone else who might be generous, they will ensure that your expenses are higher than your revenue so that you will have a negative profit. In effect, you owe them, and they will roll that debt over into next year. And now you're engaged in perpetual debt servitude. Extremely difficult, right, to accumulate wealth under these types of circumstances. Now, I know what you're thinking, which is similar, I'm sure, to what I was thinking when I first read this, which is that is a horrible deal, right? I would never agree to that, right? But here's the thing. If you don't agree to it, they have laws for that. And one of those laws are called vagrancy laws. And it states that if you can't prove that you're a landowner, that you're gainfully employed, they can charge you with a criminal offense and put you in a state or county jail, right? Now, you might say, okay, I didn't see that coming. Right. So I might sign that contract. But upon, second thought and reflection, it's still a horrible deal. I'm not going to do the work. Right. And if you did that route, then they have laws for that. And those are called contract enforcement laws. Right. Because this is a labor contract. And if you break that contract, they can charge you with a criminal offense and put you in a state or county jail. Now, you might be tempted to say, well, fine, put me in jail. I'll just sit in jail. You can keep me there for as long as you want. And then you let me out and I go about my business. If you go that route, then they have something for that. And that's called convict leasing, which means that they will lease you back out to a white landowner or a private corporation that you never wanted to work for in the first place, right? Now, here's something that we need to understand about convict leasing. There is one aspect of it that you could argue is actually even worse than slavery. And in this one respect, which is while a slave owner will kill you or beat you within an inch of your life, slaves are expensive. Right. So they would much rather have you around for another 10, 15, 20 years to maximize the return on their investment. They have an interest in your value beyond today. Under convict leasing, they have no such interest. They are only concerned with what they can extract from you during the contract period, 6 months, 8 months, 18 months. That's it. They do not care about your life beyond that point. And as a result, we're looking at mortality rates approaching about 50%. That's a 1 in 2 chance, right, of death. And as draconian as that is, it's also extremely lucrative. If you go back to 1914, you look at revenues from the state of Alabama, about 20% of that is coming from convict leasing alone, right? And the estimates of these numbers are much higher than that. And it's an extraordinary thing to believe that something like this could be imposed upon millions of people over, a long period of time. So what kind of legal framework would you need to have in place to be able to do something like this? So we'll just explore this a little bit. There's a former professor from Yale, Professor Roback, said that you can think of these Jim Crow laws as attempts to enforce an otherwise unenforceable labor market cartel amongst white employers. Basically, there's only so much that racial prejudice can do. Beyond that extent, you need the law imposed to maximize extraction of resources. So if we look at a couple of Supreme Court decisions, you go back to 1833, there's a decision that strikes down the 1875 civil rights legislation as unconstitutional. The government basically found that the government has no right to tell private citizens and businesses, that they can't discriminate against Black people. What's important here to understand is that we're in a capitalist society, which means that the means and modes of production is in the hands of private individuals and private corporations, right? And this decision enables them to be able to discriminate, right, against Black people. If you fast forward and you look at, the 1896 decision that we're all familiar with, which is the separate but equal ruling that came down, that is allowing for discrimination in the public sector under the pretense that you have equal facilities, right? Which that was never the case. And we can talk a little bit about that later. So what is the context around this, right? This is allowing unfettered discrimination, right, at all levels, both in the private, and in the public sector. You've got states, right, that start to react by, updating their constitutions, whether it's Mississippi or Louisiana or even Virginia, which their stated purpose, for example, is to discriminate to the very extremity of permissible action under the limitations of the law. That's some pointed language, right, that entire states would use. So if we look at Gary Becker, who wrote The Economics of Discrimination, former professor at University of Chicago, he says, it is proved that if effective discrimination occurs against Black people at all levels, right, by whites, then the absolute and relative income of Black people is going to decline continuously. And what we see from the legislative or the legal context is that you have the ability to discriminate against Black people at all levels, right? So you'll see a precipitous drop in earning abilities. Again, very difficult, right, to accumulate wealth under this kind of construct. And it's important to note, this is not a bad 2 or 3 year period. This lasted for about 75 years, roughly from 1870 or so into the mid 1940s. Others say that it lasted beyond that period. So I think you can imagine what that was like over that period of time. You have about 4,000 Black people that were lynched. This is that have been documented, right? There's more than this. That's the equivalent of executing 1 Black person per week, right, for 75 years. I mean, under those conditions, and nobody's been prosecuted for these things, you start to get the hint, right? Like no one is coming to save you. So, I think you start to see what I mean by 100% tax, right, on your labor. And if that is the case, then it's slavery by definition. And that's why people call this period of time slavery by another name, right? So if during the period of legal and constitutional slavery, you're able to extract up to $50 trillion from millions of people over, almost a quarter of a millennia. And this is about a third of that time period. In 1860, you've got 4 million people, Black people working in the fields. If you get into 1935, you still have almost 4 million Black people working in the fields, right? You can make an approximation that during that period of time, another 15 trillion was extracted from these newly freed people and their descendants through this kind of Jim Crow, sharecropping regime. So upon emancipation, this planter class loses about $22 trillion worth of value. Over the next many decades, they would claw back about 15 trillion of that. Very difficult, right, to accumulate wealth under these circumstances. Now, so you have the impact there of Jim Crow. Now, you can argue legitimately that not everybody was under this regime, which is true. Some people did get an education, and education is clearly the great equalizer, right? At the time, W.E.B. Du Bois went to Harvard, right? But we also have to remember is you got a misalignment in terms of what people are looking for. The white planter class is in need of massive, cheap, readily available, and abundant labor, right? White small farmers want expansion of public education for their children, as they should. Newly freed Black people want expansion of public education for themselves and their children, as they should. Planter class is not interested in that because they use a private education system, but they do need the cooperation of the small white farmer. So they agreed to the expansion of public education with the intention of diverting resources from Black children to white children. If we look at the words from Du Bois, he says in the 40 years since emancipation, that Negro taxes, Negro's share of income from indirect taxes has fully repaid, right, the investment from white people in Black people's education. He's just saying so little was put in the first place that the amount that Black people themselves put in equaled, what the white Americans put in. If we look at Thomas Logan, who was a former Confederate general and industrialist, he says, when the freedman regards himself qualified to earn a support by mental, using your intellectual prowess work, he's unwilling to accept manual labor. This is very important because manual labor is what industrialists in the South want at this time. If we look at the words of William H. Baldwin in 1914, he's the president of the General Education Board. You can think of that as the Department of Education before the Department of Education. He says that the South needed Negroes educated so they could be the best possible laborers, that with the right kind of education, Negroes will willingly work menial jobs that'll open up opportunities for Southern whites to work the more expert labor, right? A complete underdevelopment of human capital with a focus on, unskilled labor. So if we go fast forward, we look at 1917, there's about 64 public high schools in the South for Black students. Again, that's not in a district or a region or even in a state, right? That's across that gigantic area that we call the South. Most of those, by the way, were built and owned by Black people. Lots of them were appendages to churches and other such, structures. If we look at New York City back in 1920, New York City is spending 50 times more on per student in its educational system than South Carolina is spending on Black students under their segregated system, 50 times more. So if you came from Europe and you were so fortunate to settle in that area, 50 times more is being invested in your human capital development or your child's human capital development than a Black student in South Carolina whose family has been here for literally hundreds of years. For every dollar in the South spent to educate a Black student, 5 to 8 are spent and invested in educating a white child. That's not rocket science. If we did this in our families, one child would be impoverished, the other one would go to Harvard, right? And of course, if you look at teacher compensation, Black teachers are earning 25 to 34 cents on the dollar relative to what their white peers are earning. It's just very difficult to accumulate wealth, under these circumstances. And of course, white students are receiving far more education, 50% more years of education by the time they're 25 versus their Black peers, right? The effect of this is articulated by Professor Becker, Gary Becker, who wrote The Economics of Discrimination. And he says, if you look at that first 50 years of the 20th century, that Black people have advanced little in relative occupational hierarchy. More factories, more opportunities for menial work, more opportunities for janitorial work, not more opportunities for advancement when it comes to Black labor. Researchers also say that if you kept the discrimination in the marketplace the same, but really invested equally in the children, right, themselves, that alone could have cut the wage gap by about 50%, right? So when you start to think about that, over millions of children in a generation, it's over $600 billion. When you're talking about millions of children over many generations, right, from 1865 to roughly Brown v. Board of Education, you're talking about over $3 trillion, right, of opportunity cost or loss to Black families and to the country itself. So the impact on education is quite significant. Now you can also argue that at that time and in those days you didn't really need a super duper education to do well. If you had an extraordinary work ethic, you were able to acquire some land, build a house, you could do really well for your family. And home ownership, right, is clearly part of the American dream, and it's the great wealth builder, right? Absolutely. Home ownership certainly is foundational to the American dream. The country believes deeply in it and invests accordingly. Over $120 billion at the time was invested in subsidizing home ownership. In America, about $1 trillion investment today. This helped to create what we know as the property middle class, something that never existed, right? Previously. So wonderful investment. The problem was less than 2% of that went to Black Americans, while over 20 million Europeans who came during this period of time, after they naturalized and became citizens, had access to all of this kind of resources. So I won't go into like redlining and all of that. Basically, the FHA created the mortgage as we know it. The government subsidized loans. They allowed for smaller down payments. That's where the 20% comes from. Longer repayment periods. That's where the 30 years come from. And interest rates that now reflect this kind of subsidized risk. Unfortunately, they didn't provide that to Black citizens, and certainly not Black citizens who are interested in moving into better resource. White communities, financial institutions followed suit. Developers followed suit. Real estate agents refused to participate in those types of transactions. And even residents would sign agreements amongst themselves saying if they sold their property, they would only sell it to a person of European or Caucasian ancestry, right? So you've got a real wall or a phalanx that's preventing you from participating in the American dream. All of that sounds really qualitative, but what we can say in a concrete way is that between 1930 and 1960, less than 1% of all mortgages in the nation went to African Americans, which is an extraordinary thing, right? Now, just because you can't get a mortgage doesn't mean that you don't want to be part of the American dream. You clearly want to be part of the American dream. You want to own a home. So what people did is they turned to the private markets, right, under a construct called contract sales. And in the private markets, you don't have to do appraisals, right? So you have like houses selling at 2x the price. You have these, extraordinary interest rates that people are paying, and you're not accruing equity in the home, which is a particularly negative thing. So just to kind of give you an example of how this might work, let's say that we agree that I need to give you 100 installment payments before I take possession of this house. Under contract sales, if I make 99 of those payments and I miss the 100th for whatever reasons, you get to keep my 99 payments, you get to keep my down payment and take back the house and evict me, right? And resell it to someone else. And I've accrued no equity in the house, even though I was responsible for the maintenance, right? Now, something that's really important for us to understand is that if you think about that larger greater Chicagoland area, which was a huge area for the migration of Black people from the tyranny of the South, it's estimated that 85% of transactions, right, that took place within that area for Black people were done via contract sales. Extremely difficult to accumulate wealth, right, under that circumstance. And even if you say, listen, let me just kind of hunker down, save as much as I can. This will pass, right? I'll be able to buy a house later. It was also very difficult because, it turns out that rents inside of these urban kind of Black communities was more than 50% higher than outside of them. Something that seems completely counterintuitive. Why would a residence that's less desirable cost more than places outside of it that are more desirable? Well, what you have is, over many decades, you've got the migration of 6 million Black people from the South. They're unable to move into better, well-resourced white communities. They're forced into these inner city type communities. So what happens when the demand for housing goes up faster than availability of housing? The price goes up, right, as a correction. So again, the prices are even higher inside of these communities and outside. Lots of pressure on your ability to save. If you go back to 1968, Federal Trade Commission did a study on goods and services within these communities, and they found that goods are trading at 3 times as much. They're 3 times more expensive in these communities than they are outside those communities, right? And most of these things are being paid for by a credit, which has significant markups and interest rates on it. So difficult to accumulate wealth. And even just working your way through it, keep your nose to the grindstone and just drive do the best you can in the workplace. You've got millions of people who are facing high levels of labor market discrimination. So if you look at between 1929 and 1960, the estimates for the cost of discrimination against Black people in the labor market is about 1.6 trillion. Back in 1983 dollars, if you bring that forward to today, it's over $4 trillion. So lots of pressure, right, on your ability to save and accumulate resources. And you've got some professors from the University of Bonn that did a study since 70-year study since World War II, and they found that there's been no closure or progress made in closing both the wealth and income gaps between Black and white households since World War II up until the present, right? That's a particularly extraordinary thing to hear and to realize, but just some of the information that we covered in this part of the conversation gives some context as to why it would be so hard to actually close those gaps. So when you start thinking about impact of education, again, followed by housing, it becomes, extraordinary. And then, of course, compounded by discrimination in the labor market, very difficult to accumulate wealth. There is also the New Deal and the GI Bill, which we won't have a chance to really cover and kind of go through, but you can read about that stuff in the book. There is the impact of the interstate highway development and investment across the country. And of course, there is post-civil rights up until today, what has been the financial costs of anti-Black discrimination that's associated with that. So we kind of talked about this continuum that gets us to where we are today. You've got the impact of labor extracted from millions of people over a quarter of a millennia, the impact of the follow-on extraction through the Jim Crow construct, Of course, is the juxtaposition of labor of the land that was not distributed to Black people, but was distributed, to white people at the same effectively time period. You got the impact on education, housing, labor, and of course, the GI Bill, New Deal, interstate highway. And that leads us to kind of where we are today, which is why we could see these really large gaps in terms of wealth, in terms of jobs, particularly, and businesses with employees. So where are we right now? The Black community is, missing about $1.2 trillion. $1.52 trillion, half a trillion is associated with consumer income, and $1 trillion of that is associated with business income. We talked about the gap itself and a gap in terms of jobs and businesses. So something that I noticed as I was kind of doing the research and the work associated with this is this number kept popping up again and again and again. And it seemed like it was like this 2% rule, which is in areas that are really critical for wealth building and accumulation. We tend to hover around like a 2% participation rate. So if you look at corporate supply chain spend, pretty much across the board, it's less than 2%. Again, this is on Black enterprise, not just kind of minority spend. Government supply chain spend at local, state, federal level is less than 2% with Black enterprise. Even spending amongst Black people with Black enterprise is less than 2% of our consumer income. And then, of course, our presence in almost every high growth, high compensation field tends to be hovering around these 2% levels. If you look at SBA lending, it's less than 2%. It was about 1.6%, pre-COVID. And then, of course, in terms of, business formation, venture capital, angel, friends and family round, all that's less than kind of 2%. So this clearly has a negative and depressive impact, right, on job creation, business formation, and expansion in the Black community. Give some real context as to some of the challenges, right, that we're dealing with. One of the things that I do want to talk to you about is this really great question that I got asked when I did my first talk at Google. And, one of the questions was, we have a better understanding of the cost of discrimination, right, against Black people, right, past and present, because you talk a little bit about what it costs the country. I thought this was a brilliant, brilliant question. I didn't really have the answer at the time. I said I would look into it and kind of get back to folks. I was fortunate to be asked to speak there again. And I approached it from this perspective, which is, what if Black Americans have been allowed to participate fully in the innovation that drove the economy? This is a really, really profound question, right? So this Jim Crow period that we spent a lot of time talking about was also the heart of the Industrial Revolution. It's an extraordinarily technologically productive period, right, of time. You've got 2.5 million patents are created during this time, everything from telephone to motion pictures to photocopiers, transistors, whole tech industries based on that, automobiles, aircraft, so on and so forth. If you say how many of those patents are attributed to Black people, it's about 726. Shockingly low number, right? So what is the impact, right, of that, and why is this particularly important? So if we look at what Professor Kortun from Yale says a constant flow of new patents could generate a constant rate of economic growth. This is demonstrable in the data. You can look at this over 150-year period. If you look at the Brookings Institute, it says that the nation's unequal access to high quality schooling deprives the innovation system, right, of a large number of people who might otherwise make or commercialize important discoveries. And it's something that's really important, right, that I think people just need to know in general, is that talent, skill, capability tends to follow like a normal distribution or a Gaussian curve. Really fancy way of saying 70% of people tend to be in the middle, right? 15% tend to be substantially above folks. I call that group the ultra brilliant. We all like to think we're a part of that group, and 15% are substantially below. A really important, question that I had was, what is the size of that 15% of Black ultra brilliance, and what were those folks doing in this kind of Jim Crow period? And if you look at the population size in 1870, it's about 730,000 people. Again, that's not the Black population. That's just that 15%, right, of ultra brilliant. That grows to 1.3 by 1900. almost 1.8 by 1930, almost 2.3 million people by 1950. What are these folks actually doing during this time period, right? 1870, 1900, even to the 30s, they're principally doing variations of, sharecropping, tenant farming, and all kinds of domestic work, things that are substantially below their capability and their skill set. Even by the time you get into the 1950s, only 1.6% of Black people even have, college degrees, a massive underutilization, right, of brilliance. So one of the things is to think about is, well, what's the impact, right, on wealth and income associated with that? Because if these people had been fully included in that innovation system, we'd be looking at 280,000 more patents, not 726, right? And that would have driven an incremental $2 trillion, right, in GDP on an ongoing basis, and over $9 trillion of wealth associated with it. That's what we're all losing, right, for having not included, this brilliance into the innovation system. And there's a researcher from Michigan State that asked this really interesting question, which is, what would have happened to innovation if white Americans had experienced the trauma that Black Americans felt from Jim Crow, right? And what she found was that about 40% of the patents would have never been created. Which 40% of these amazing innovations can we actually do without? And what would have been the impact of that on national income and GDP and wealth, right? We would have seen 1 million less patents. It would have led to almost 8 trillion less in GDP and over $30 trillion less in wealth. When we look at the work of Professor Gary Becker, discrimination reduces commerce, right? And discrimination, both parties who engage in discrimination pay an economic price for it, both the discriminator and the discriminated. That's obviously proportional to the capital difference between the two. The pie is smaller when you actually have discrimination, right? Either in the macroeconomy or when you have it within corporations, organizations, institutions, so on and so forth. We're paying a huge price for it. The price to Black people clearly is extraordinary. There is also a great cost to the country for this type of behavior. The pie is bigger when you develop and when you deploy skills within and across populations. So I'm going to kind of share 2 quotes with you. Again, one is from Albert Einstein, and he said, the worst disease under which the society of our nation suffers, in his opinion, is the treatment of the Negro. You have a little bit of context, right, as to why he might arrive at that conclusion at that time. And of course, from Emperor Selassie, in an address that he gave to the United Nations General Assembly back in 1963, he said, the basis for racial discrimination has been economic, and it is with economics that these evils can be overcome. I agree with that statement. So I'm going to pause here. We can talk a little bit about the PhD economic framework, solutions, the importance of specificity when it comes to these solutions, and kind of answer any general questions that you may have. I'm going to stop sharing and come back to you. And also just to let you know, if I'm happy to stick around and plan to engage in further discussion if we get past our time limit. So thank you very much for that presentation. I look forward to continuing the conversation.
Good evening. My name is Keith Jackson, one of the co-founders of C.F. Berg, the Collective. And at this point in time, we're going to be doing some Q&A. So if you do have any questions you want to ask Shawn, please send them over, and we'll get right to them. Also, as a reminder, you'll be able to watch this presentation that's being recorded on our LinkedIn C.F. Berg page, as well as our YouTube C.F. Berg page as well.
Don't be shy. I won't bite.
Yes, please come with your questions.
Well, if you don't mind, while we're waiting for questions, there's
Let me ask you a question, Shawn, just to get us started. What would be the solutions for us to kind of nullify the black tax?
So that's a great question. That's a gigantic question, right? So I want to They've written a whole book on that just starts to really scratch the surface. So let's kind of put things in real context, right? The full impact of all this is a $14 trillion wealth gap, right? And that gap is driving almost all the socioeconomic problems. So the first order of business that I start with is let's think about the appropriate framework upon which to judge the efficacy of our policies, plans, and programs, right? And I call that framework this idea of PhD, which is how we, either as individuals or as corporations, institutions, government, purchase, hire, and deposit in ways that have a direct stimulative impact on job creation, right? Business formation and expansion, and capital availability and affordability within the Black community. We need to take actions in ways that are driving jobs, business, and capital, right? Because those three gaps are what are having this impact. So what are the different kinds of ways that we can do that? So when you start talking about the P, that's just the purchase if you're an individual, right? We have our own P&Ls. What do we choose to spend our money on? Right now, we're spending about 2% of it on Black enterprise. We need to dramatically increase that number. And we can do so by just, including Black realtors when we buy homes, looking at Black auto dealers when we're making large purchases, right? We have to insure these things. We can make sure we include Black insurance brokers and agents in these transactions, right? Then we think about, adding onto our homes, if we're so fortunate to be able to do that, Black architects and designers and contractors and craftspeople. I mean, these are huge portions, right, of our spend. There's high quality folks that are out there that we can kind of bring in to that process. If you're a corporation, then that is your supply chain spend, right? And how will we make sure that Black enterprises are better represented across corporate supply chain spend? Because we're at this average 2% level. And incorporating or doing more spend with Black enterprise can be stimulative to creating tens of thousands of jobs, right, at a time. And how are we ensuring that those businesses are better positioned, they're better financed, they have the working capital, they have the acquisition capital, right? They have the coaching and other mentorship that's necessary so that they can drive and do a relationship with higher and higher contract, values. On a basis. So it's like the actions that we take need to follow this PhD framework to get a 10x multiplier, right? Effect. So I start with the framework, which is if it's not stimulative to jobs, business, and capital, it's a shiny object, and it might be well-intentioned, but it's going to have no real economic impact. We need to have direct stimulative impacts for jobs creation, business formation, expansion, capital availability, and affordability in the Black community specifically. Right? Like that's how we judge the efficacy of it. Then we can start talking about which particular policies and plans and investments have the largest impact under that structure and framework.
Okay. Got a question for you.
Mm-hmm.
What have you found to be the most successful ways of promoting policy to correct these inequities? Any grassroots organizations we should be aware of?
So that's a great question. In terms of what I try to do is shift the paradigm, right? Because if we want different actions, new actions has to follow new thinking, right? We have to be careful for providing plans to people who don't see the problem or solutions people don't see the problem. So one of the things was just taking the approach that I took, which is let's look at things from a quantitative perspective. Let's not look at it from a qualitative perspective, because if we're qualitative, we can agree to disagree, right? But the numbers are the numbers. And when it's coming from institutions that we have a lot of faith in and care deeply about, either it is or it's not, right? The math is in the same as my office as your office. I think that approach needs to be multiplied, right? Across all conversations and discussions. It's in the language of business that people communicate in. People aren't offended by it. Because they simply just didn't know. In terms of specific grassroots organizations, there's a lot out there. I can't kind of give you a list on those because I hyper focus on economic impact, and there's a lot of folks that are doing some terrific work when it comes to social justice and other things that aren't directly kind of economic.
Okay, I see that we have a few questions about the HR 40 reparations bill. What are your thoughts on that?
So I give you my thoughts on reparations in particular. right? There's people who talk about the bill specifically. Is it necessary? Yes, it's necessary. It's always been necessary, right? Repairing damage that was done is a normal and consistent thing across social organizations, across various belief systems, so on and so forth, right? My greater concern is not whether or not it should be done. It should absolutely be done. It is ensuring that people realize that as part of it, you need to have a creation of a business and financial infrastructure for which those resources circulate through, right? And you get the multiplier effect. Again, we talked about the fact that only 2% of our spend is within our own enterprises, right? That means 98% is outside of it. So even if you got public opinion where it needs to be, people empathized and understood, right? And they decided that they're going to distribute $1 million, right, per family. Well, what's going to happen if you don't have that business infrastructure, right? It'll be the greatest economic stimulus the world has ever seen 100 times over, but you'll have a massive outflow of resources. It will create jobs in every other community, because if you don't have the business infrastructure to be part of how it circulates, it becomes extremely problematic, right? So what I want to see is that as part of it, right? Now, the other thing that's important for people to understand is it's going to be enormously stimulating for the entire economy. If done well, would clearly reduce or eliminate these gaps. You have to have the financial business infrastructure to do that. Otherwise, it's going to be economic pass-through, right? And that's going to drive more impact in terms of GDP, right? McKinsey's done their own work, right? And they've said if you eliminate kind of the wealth gap, it's going to drive an incremental $1.5 trillion on an annual basis, right? That this type of thing would pay for itself. But if you don't follow like a PhD framework, and you don't have that business infrastructure and the complementary financial infrastructure that's underneath it, my fear is, logic says, my understanding of economics says, it's just going to be a giant economic pass-through. And people need to see that a mile away and be planning accordingly.
Okay, sounds good. Get that. Next question. How do we educate our children about this? Any books or presentations that you would recommend?
Absolutely. I recommend The Black Tax, right? All day, every day, right? And while that is kind of a gratuitous plug, this information and the way it's organized doesn't really exist, right? So I went to literally hundreds of sources to put together a mosaic that lays this out, right? So to really short circuit the work that anyone else has to do. Because at the end of the day, we need to understand what was the economic impact of these things, right? So we can separate this from being the fault of the individual versus the environment that was created for these individuals, right? To get through. What I will also do is I do have like a blog where I have a list of a number of books that I consider, outstanding reading to understand race and economics, right? And I can share that, with the entire organization. That covers everything from, Walter Rodney to Thomas Piketty, right? To Thinking Fast, Thinking Slow, to I think it was called like the origins of white people, or the history of white people. Is a bunch of things that added together give us great insight and understanding. So I've aggregated that list. I'll share it with the leadership team. You can share it out, amongst everyone else. It's every single book in there is powerful and transformative, right? I will not waste your time.
But your book is the first one we need to read, correct?
Yeah, it feels good to make something that you can honestly recommend that is tier one, right? And it, independent of whether it's the layperson, it's the CXO, it's the diplomat, the reaction is the same. Like I wouldn't set that bar that high unless it was very easy to overachieve. Proof is in the pudding, right? You don't got to take my word, for anything.
Okay, next question we have is, what's the pushback here? This is what do people contest in your approach numbers? So if so through, let me read this again. What's the pushback here? This is what people do. What do people contest in your approach / numbers? It's so through in precise. I'm hard pressed to see how it might be challenged. So are you getting pushback on this?
Yeah, no, I don't really get pushback because I'm not giving you my opinion. I haven't told you how I feel about anything, right? I'm giving you what the data says. So if you don't like it, and I understand it, then feel free to reach out to the researchers at Harvard and kind of recalculate their statistical analysis and other institutions to isolate racialized impact. And when you're done with that, I have 300 or 400 more sources for you. It's not built on any one piece of data. It lays out a cumulative and longitudinal view of the economic impact of discrimination, right, against Black people. It's just too overwhelming, right, to be able to kind of shoot at the various pieces. And then most people are far too engaged in qualitative conversations. If you have a different set of numbers, feel free to bring forth. But it'll be a long night.
So another question for you. How does this Black text play out in access to capital and entrepreneurship, and our current policies and protections sufficient?
This is a fundamental integral problem, right? So there was a study back, I think in 2012, St. Louis Fed, and it was like, the average amount of liquid resources a Black family has is $200, right? Including retirement. Happy to share the link with you. You know what I mean? What's a family and friend round going to look like? Right? That's associated with that. That's where the first tranche of capital comes from, right? It comes from personal capital. This is a fundamental, problem. And you have Black entrepreneurs who enter into entrepreneurship at half the rate, right, as their white peers, but they leave entrepreneurship at twice the rate. At every level of credit worthiness, from excellent to fair to good to poor, Black entrepreneurs pay higher interest rates. Your cost of capital is higher, right? Anti-Black discrimination shows up with an impact being depressive to revenue growth. Right. So you have cost pressures, and then you have pressures on your revenue as well. And then you don't have access to capital to kind of weather the storm. So you can be directionally correct, but unable to kind of, flow through it. So this is a dramatic and a significant problem, which is part of why we need to have very tailored solutions for Black enterprise. Unfortunately, the vast majority of Black businesses are micro businesses. Right? They're not even small businesses, right? So 4% have employees. And I think that the number is less than 2% do more than 10 million a year. So there needs to be massive investment, right? Which includes grant capital, right? Because everything can't be, equity and debt, particularly in the very, very early stages. And then, capital at every growth stage, across the spectrum.
You spoke a bit about education and how it was expected to be the great equalizer. I've seen recent statistics that highlight the abundance of advanced degrees earned by Black women, and at the same time, statistics that indicate Black women are generally the lowest paid employees. What do you feel drives this great disconnect?
Well, Black women are dealing with two levels of bias. They're dealing with anti-Black bias, and then they're dealing with bias associated with gender-based bias. Right. So you have that compounding effect. Now, at every level, Black peers tend to be overeducated. Right. So if you look at the top 5% of wealth amongst Black families and white families, there's a higher level of education and degrees, right, associated with Black people, because you need to do that to be able to overachieve, to try to compensate for the impacts of these biases. Right. So there are a lot of significant challenges. For example, other families have intergenerational transfers, right? We call them inheritances. So if you're Black, you're 5 times less likely to get inheritance. And when you do get the inheritance, it's 1/10 the size of your white peer, right? And only about 20% of it goes to increasing your wealth. But for your white peer, it's about 90% goes to increasing wealth. So you've got these massive gaps in terms of your start in life, because you don't have that intergenerational wealth transfer because of all the reasons that we talked about. You have a white family, head of household, didn't even graduate from high school, right, has greater wealth than a Black family head of household is a college graduate, right? These reverberating intergenerational, impacts, right? So getting a high quality education is critically important, right? But it does not allow you to escape discrimination associated with being Black. Now, let me be even more concrete, right? So if you look at the work from Gary Becker, and you go back and you can read Economics of Discrimination yourself, right? He says as the level of education increases for Black people, the level of discrimination also increases, right? If we go start looking at, work that Stanford did on kind of Black-led VCs and whatnot, there's clearly incremental returns that they are driving, which should be a objective number, is not being interpreted as better performance, right? These we don't examine the level that of anti-Blackness that exists and how it plays out. If your child is gifted and talented, right? They have these kind of categorizations in different places. If they are, not if they have the potential to be, they are right now gifted and talented, right? Their non-Black teacher, it's more difficult for them to see that gifted and talentedness in them, right? So your presence is interpreted differently when you're Black. And your work product, according to research, is also interpreted differently. Like, these are just the basic foundational things that people need to know so we can design the best possible, programs and solutions so that everybody's winning. Because again, this is not new. As an economic principle, discrimination reduces commerce between groups. Period. End of story. The pie is smaller, right? And the pie is absolutely smaller when you underdevelop folks and you underdeploy their skill set, right? No one's doing anybody a favor, right? By developing and deploying skills. That's a win for everyone, right? And it's a new thought in many cases, right? It shouldn't be, but that's the fact pattern, and it's corroborated by the data.
Another question for you. How can we amplify this message to reach a broader audience so our legislatures can't continue to ignore it?
Yeah, so I don't think so. Let me answer the first question, right? Okay. Which is share this talk, share the book, share these perspectives broadly and widely, right? With your friends, with people who kind of respect your views on things. Share it broadly and widely. The other thing that's important to understand is, a lot of people don't have this information. They don't have this perspective. They do have belief systems and they're very passionate about them. While we may go to educational systems that vary widely in terms of resources, it's the same curriculum, right? And this isn't in it. So people know what they know about Black people and about Black history in a Black context today, what they are learning or not learning from the exposure to curriculum, what they're learning or not learning from what they see on the media, right? And what they're learning and not learning from what they observe kind of in their walk of life. Almost all of that is devoid of this context, right? So call them, share it, with them. I'm happy to kind of do talks and conversations and whatever. If people who have an outsized ability to amplify this message, please do so, right? Because it tends to be very well received. It is objective, right? It is not indicting. The facts are the facts, right? And we're losing for it. Even if your intentions are good, are the outcomes consistent, with those intentions?
Okay. Well, that's it for all the questions. You guys asked some very great questions, so thank you for those. We are now going to be doing the second drawing for a signed copy of Shawn's book. So please go into the comment section and put hashtag capital letters CF Berg. More times you enter, the better chance you have to win the book. And the winner is Janelle Campbell. You are the winner of the second free copy of Shawn's book, which he will sign for you. Please stay on so we can get your information. So thank you for that. I think, Shawn, just want to thank you on behalf of C.F. Berg and the Collective. We want to thank you for joining us tonight for this presentation. It has been recorded. It will be available on our C.F. Berg LinkedIn pages and YouTube channel as well. Also, we want to mention that today, as Renee outlined, the U.S. Senate and the U.S. House of Representatives recently signed legislation to make Juneteenth a federal holiday. President Biden signed it today as well. So for this upcoming Juneteenth holiday celebration, it's a time for us to acknowledge, celebrate, and educate. So please enjoy your Juneteenth holiday. Also, please join us on June 21st for the View from the House. That will be held next week on Monday, the 21st at 4 p.m. We have an outstanding panel of legislative people in the U.S. House who are going to talk about their thoughts about being the first gay LGBTQ U.S. House representatives. So thank you once again.